Hello again. Today I am very excited because we are going to read the third story in The Princess Hynchatti and Some Other Surprises by Tanith, which is one of my absolute favorites. This one is Princess Sansu. Right, here we go. The only trouble with Princess Sansu's hair was that it simply wasn't long enough. There was nothing else wrong. It was fine and shining and a most beautiful golden color, but it reached only to her waist. The king and queen's other 4 daughters all had hair that reached to the back of their knees, and so did the queen, and so did Sansu's grandmother. Every morning the king would come into the dining room, and the queen and the grandmother and the 5 princesses would all sit down. The king would walk along behind their chairs and see that they were all sitting on their hair, except, that is, for poor Sansu. Then he would take out his tape measure, measure her hair, sigh, put the tape measure back, and then sit down and push away his plate of bacon and eggs. "No," he would say in a sad voice, "I'm not very hungry today." Sansu privately thought it was all a bit silly. She didn't like being a disappointment to her parents, but really, there didn't seem to be any hope. At one time, she used to tie herself to the top of the banisters with 3 or 4 old woolly socks knotted together, and ask her 2 pet dogs to take half of the ends of her hair in each of their mouths and pull very hard. She had thought it might stretch, but it didn't. What actually happened was that the banister post, weakened by so much pulling, eventually came loose, and Sansu and the dogs fell over and rolled all the way downstairs, all jumbled up in the hair and the 3 or 4 woolly socks. The king said please would she not do it again, as it gave him a headache. Sansu promised she wouldn't. One morning, however, the king, instead of coming into breakfast looking sad, ran in smiling. "Dear Sansu," he said, "our troubles are at an end. I have written to the witch who lives over the mountains about your hair, and she says she can do something for us. She will be here in time for tea." Well, unfortunately, this was the worst thing he could have done. The king didn't know, but this witch was a dreadful old thing called Knight Mary, who never did anything good if she could help it. The trouble was that ever since she could remember, she had always been trying to win the Best Bad Witch of the Year award. To get first prize, you had to do not only something really awful, but something which had never been done before. This was pretty difficult. Every year, Knight Mary had rushed around turning people into frogs and pillars of rock, or getting princesses to fall into 100-year sleeps, only to find that it had already been done. But this year, she was determined to win. She had printed a big red notice which read, "Knight Mary for Wickedest Witch of the Year," and pinned it up in her mountain cave, facing her bed, where she could see it the moment she woke up. When Knight Mary got the king's letter about Sansu's hair, she had a marvelous idea. So she kicked an old raven out of bed and made it fly to the king and say that she would be on her way at once. Then she put on her black witch's robe. She usually wore an old dressing gown and an apron about the cave, and her witch's hat, and jumped on her flying crocodile. It wasn't a real crocodile. It was made of magic cardboard, had big wings, and a tail that occasionally fell off. Sometimes a real flying crocodile would go past and laugh and make the poor thing terribly embarrassed. "Well," said Knight Mary, as they flew over Sansu's father's kingdom, "what a pleasant spot, just by the sea. Couldn't be better." And she gave the cardboard crocodile a kick because she was so pleased. The crocodile sniveled. The king and the queen and the 5 princesses and their grandmother and the 2 pet dogs were all outside in the palace garden having tea when the witch flew down. The moment she got off the cardboard crocodile, it ran up to the table and started gobbling up all the fruit salad and cream. Knight Mary never gave it anything nice to eat. Everyone jumped up and screamed, and Knight Mary gave it a good kick. It went off and sat under an elm tree with its back to them. "Do take a seat, madam," said the king. "I'm afraid I can't offer you any tea." The crocodile had upset the teapot. "Or any lemonade either," he added. It had upset that too. "Let's get down to business," said Knight Mary. "Which one is Sansu?" Sansu thought the witch was rather rude, but she came and stood in front of her and said, "I am?" "Good, good," said Knight Mary. "We'll get started at once, then." And she took out some red chalk and drew a nasty, messy circle on the king's lawn, and made Sansu stand in the middle of it. Then she threw colored powders about, most of which fell on the sandwiches, and said little pieces of poetry such as, "Griddle me, riddle me, fiddle-dee-dee, oceans of porridge run down to the sea," and "Harum scarum, give 'em a fright, measles by day and mumps at night." None of these sounded either very sensible or very nice, but Knight Mary seemed pleased. Eventually, she produced a dusty, sticky-looking wand, wiped it on the king's tablecloth, and hit Sansu on the head with it. There was a flash of gold lightning. "There!" cried Knight Mary. Then she hugged herself and chortled merrily, "Who's going to be best witch of the year?" Began the king rather nervously. "Will Sansu's hair grow now?" "Oh, yes!" cried Knight Mary, "and so fast it won't know itself." And then her face took on a really unpleasant look, and she said, "It will grow and grow and grow, and nothing can stop it. And the moment it touches the ground—" She paused dramatically. "Yes?" everyone asked anxiously. "A great tidal wave will sweep in from the sea and cover your kingdom," Knight Mary finished. "Oh!" cried the queen, turning pale. Sansu's 2 dogs ran into the palace to pack their dog biscuits and bone in a waterproof bag. "This is disgraceful," declared the king. "Isn't it?" agreed Knight Mary happily. "I shall cut Sansu's hair before it reaches the ground," said Sansu's grandmother. But that was no good either. "You'll find nothing can cut through Sansu's hair," said the witch. "I've put a spell on it. Try if you like." So the king ran hurriedly indoors, colliding with the 2 dogs who were digging up the last bones from the rose beds, got a pair of scissors. Everyone tried to cut Sansu's thick hair, the king, the queen, the grandmother, and the 4 princesses, but nobody could. The scissor blades seemed to go right through, but somehow they didn't. "Isn't there anything that will do it?" cried the king. "Oh, yes," said the witch. "I've got a pair of magic scissors at home. They're the only pair I've got, but they can cut through anything. They'd do it. And what's more, if you cut the hair with them, it would go back to normal and stop growing. But you won't be able to get at those. They're in my cave, in a magic box, and only I know the right spell to open it." And so saying, with a nasty laugh, she jumped onto the cardboard crocodile, and they rose into the sky. "Whatever shall we do?" cried the king. Then he noticed that Sansu's hair was already growing fast and had nearly reached her ankles. Get up on the table, dear," he said hastily. Sansu did, and soon they had put a chair on the table, and she had to stand on that, too. It really was an awful situation. Soon Sansu was standing on 3 chairs on top of 4 tables, and her hair was growing all the time, and then the sun sank, and it began to get cold. "Well, there's no help for it," said Sansu's grandmother, who was a practical old lady. "Sansu will have to go into the tower at the bottom of the garden." The tower was very tall, with an outside stone staircase leading up to a little round room at the top. It was damp and draughty, and the roof had blown away long ago. Still, it couldn't be helped. The grandmother and the princesses formed a line and took hold of Sansu's hair and held it very carefully above the ground, while the king lifted her down. Still holding it, like a sort of train, they followed Sansu to the tower and up the stairs. In the room, they let it fall on the floor, but it soon piled up and had to be hung out of a window. Meanwhile, the queen had hurriedly got together as many quilts and shawls and hot water bottles as she could, and came and wrapped Sansu up in them. Then everyone except Sansu went down the stairs again and looked at the hair hanging out of the window. "By morning, it will be at least halfway down," said the king worriedly. "Well," said the grandmother, "you'll just have to get a team of men together to make a wooden section to fit on top of the tower, and some more stairs. Sansu will go and sit in that, and then they will make another one to fit on top of the first one, and so on. Sansu will just keep going upstairs until we think of something else." And so this is what they did. Poor Sansu. All day long the garden was full of the sound of men hammering together the next section of the tower, and grumbling. And at night it got dreadfully quiet and lonely. The king or queen or one of Sansu's sisters was continually running up and down the stairs. At dinner time the king brought up her dinner, but it was always cold by the time he reached the tower room. Soon Sansu could see over the tops of trees and out to the sea. The sailors thought the tower was a funny sort of lighthouse and couldn't understand why there was no light in it. The birds who lived in the elms and oaks around the tower wrote a rude letter to the king, complaining that since it had got so tall it shut the sun out of their nests, and an elderly crow, who lived in the tower itself, wrote a worse letter, saying he had not asked for a lodger, and that he was going to complain to somebody about it. The king had messengers ride around the land to see if anyone had any bright ideas about what they could do, but no one had. It rained, and the wooden roof leaked, and Sansu's 2 dogs, who always tried to get up to see her at least once a week — it took them almost a week to get up and down the stairs — brought her an umbrella to sit under. Sansu, meanwhile, was racking her brains for a way to get out of the tower. She'd been very good about the whole thing, but really, it was a bit much to expect her to stay up there forever. She tried to talk it over with the crow, but it rudely told her that lodgers were bad enough, but noisy lodgers were intolerable. So she had to think in silence. And the tower grew and grew. Soon, Sansu could see the clouds outside the window. Then one morning, Sansu was awakened by the most awful crash. "Must you make such a din?" complained the crow. "It wasn't me," said Sansu. "And someone is pulling my hair." "Of course it was, and of course there isn't," said the crow. "Noisy lodgers are intolerable, but noisy lodgers who tell lies are even worse." And it fluttered out its feathers. Just then, an angry little face with a long gray beard and bushy eyebrows appeared at the window. "I would like to know, madam," said the face to Sansu, "that I am wizard busy, and I've just had a nasty accident with your beastly tower. Your tower is a public nuisance, madam. It's too tall, and you can't see through the cloud. I've just driven my winged chariot right slap bang into it, and now both it and I are tangled up in all this hair you have so inconsiderately hung out of your window." Sansu apologized, and going out into the staircase, she managed to untangle the wizard, who in turn untangled the chariot. The wizard still seemed so annoyed that Sansu gave him some lemonade, and explained to him all about the tower, and how her hair kept on growing, and the dreadful witch, Night Mary. Finally she added, rather wistfully, "I suppose you can't think of any way for me to stop it growing and get back to normal so that I can come down?" "No," admitted the wizard, "I can't. As Night Mary said, the only way to do that is to cut it with her magic scissors. Then it will go back to its normal length, and not otherwise. But," he added, "I can tell you why Night Mary did it." And he explained about the Best Bad Witch of the Year competition. "And now," he finished, "I expect Night Mary is sitting in her cave waiting for someone to come along and say she's won and give her first prize. Only she hasn't, and they won't, because your hair hasn't touched the ground yet, and the tidal wave hasn't happened after all. Well, must dash off now." And off he rode. That was when Sansu suddenly thought of an idea. She took the horn that she had to blow whenever she wanted anything, and blew it with all her might. The crow clapped its wings over its ears and scowled. A few hours later, when everybody had reached the top of the tower, Sansu told them what she was going to do. The first thing Sansu did was to ask the king to get everyone in the kingdom to come over to the tower, and then spread out in a huge chain. This started at the foot of the staircase and stretched across the garden, out into the town, along the beach, to the outskirts of a big wood, and then back from the wood to the beach to the town, from the town to the palace, and across the gardens to the foot of the tower again. Sansu dressed herself in a very old smock, with the hood dyed black, a black pointed witch's hat made of cardboard, a nasty false nose, and a pair of thick spectacles. Her hair was hidden under the hat, the hood, and the smock, and appeared again at the bottom of the silly appeared again at the bottom like a silly sort of golden tail. Next, she picked up a large brown paper parcel and tucked it under one arm. Then she came out of her room and stepped slowly down the staircase, lowering her golden hair ahead of her. As soon as this got near enough, the first person in the chain grabbed it, and as more of it cascaded downward, he passed his bit to the next person and held the new lot. In this way, the hair was passed along the chain, and when it came to the very last pair of hands, which happened to be those of an old blacksmith in a temper, Sansu was at the bottom of the tower and took the final handover herself. In no place did the hair touch the ground. "Now," said Sansu, "we must set out for the mountain." But everyone began to ask where was the princess, and she had quite a job explaining that she was in disguise. When she had eventually convinced everybody that she was really the princess, and all the children who were frightened had stopped crying, they set out. The journey to the mountain took a long time, but the people had brought plenty of food with them. Of course, Sansu's hair was still growing, but whenever it got too near the ground, somebody would wind it around and around themselves to hold it up a bit higher. This worked very well, except that the women kept losing their knitting in it, and several birds flew down and built their nests in it. And a very small mouse, called Cuthbert, somehow got caught up in it and couldn't find the way out. He later wrote a book about his experiences, from which it was quite clear that he thought Sansu's hair was a cornfield. Anyway, somehow or other, the chain made its way up the mountain, Sansu leading them in her black hat and false nose and spectacles, still carrying the parcel under her arm and the ends of her hair in the other hand. It was dusk when they came to the edge of the little wood and saw Night Mary's cave in the mountain face just in front of them. Sansu asked everybody to be very quiet, and then she took the ends of her long hair, plaited them into 4 thick braids, and tied them round the large brown paper parcel. She did them up with some very complicated awkward knots, and then asked the nearest people to unwind themselves a little, and as they did, she was able to go forward until she reached the cave mouth. She knocked on the door. "Go away," said a bad-tempered voice from inside the cave. Night Mary was feeling very angry that she hadn't heard anything about winning the Best Bad Witch award yet. "Night Mary," said Sansu in a funny cracked voice, rather like Night Mary's own, "do let me in. I've got something for you." Night Mary couldn't ignore that. She flung open the cave door at once. "May I congratulate you," croaked Sansu, "on being this year's Best Bad Witch. Here is your prize." And she held out the brown paper parcel tied up with her own hair. Her smock hid the rest of her hair, and it was very dark in the cave. "I'll hold it for you, dear," rasped Sansu, "while you undo the string." Night Mary did her best. She fumbled and scrabbled at the knots, but in vain. "Bother this string," she said at last. "I'll have to cut it. What was that?" she added. "I thought I heard a baby crying," and she peered out of the cave, but it was so dark she couldn't see anything, even though there seemed to be a lot more trees about than she remembered. She was too excited to worry, however. "I'll just get my magic scissors," she told Sansu. She turned to a cupboard and took out a big black box. She threw some pink powder at it and yelled, "Darned socks, hollyhocks, spring locks, open box." The box opened. Night Mary pulled out the magic scissors, and the next moment she had cut through all 4 of Sansu's plaits. At once a great cheer went up from the wood. Sansu's hair had vanished completely, except for her own golden curls, which hung to her waist. Out of the hair which had vanished had fallen knitting and nests and a lot of birds and paper bags and some teaspoons and Cuthbert. Sansu took off the false nose and spectacles and the hat and the hood and looked Night Mary in the eye and cried, "Boo!" The witch began to threaten all sorts of nasty things, but the old blacksmith, who was still in a bad temper, chased her back into the cave, and she shut and bolted the door. Just then the cardboard crocodile, who had been hiding in some bushes, came out and begged Sansu to take it with her. "The witch has always been unbearable," it said, "but now I don't know what she'll do." So Sansu rode back to the palace on it, and never kicked once. "Well," said the king when she got home, "I'm glad that's all over, and I shan't mind your hair being so short any more. I won't ever measure it again." But Sansu had her own ideas. The cardboard crocodile had convinced her that she ought to go to witch school, and then she might be able to win Best Good Witch of the Year award, or something like that. She rode off onto the crocodile a few days later with the 2 pet dogs who had decided to go to witch school too. Everyone missed her very much, and the old crow left the tower, and instead of living with the king, and insisted on living with the king and queen. It confessed that unasked-for, noisy lodgers who told lies were better than no lodgers at all. The end.